The harsh clang of metal striking metal echoed through the dusty Wyoming Territory air as Nora Thompson hammered another railroad spike into place, her hands raw and blistered beneath thin work gloves that had long since worn through. It was 1878, and the Union Pacific's western expansion waited for no one, not even a 22-year-old woman who'd never imagined she'd find herself doing men's work on the frontier. "You're keeping up better than half the men," called Mr. Hollister, the rail crew foreman, as he passed by inspecting the day's progress. "But you need to pace yourself, girl. We've got 10 more miles before Sweetwater." Nora merely nodded, not wanting to waste breath on conversation. 6 months ago, she'd been teaching in a Philadelphia schoolhouse. Now she was here, having followed her father west after her mother's death, only to lose him to pneumonia, taking him just 3 weeks after they'd arrived. The railroad had been the only outfit willing to hire a woman with no connections and dwindling funds. The sun beat down mercilessly as Nora positioned another spike. Her hands trembled with exhaustion, but she couldn't afford to stop. Payment came by the mile of track laid, and she needed every penny to keep a roof over her head at Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house. "Water break?" someone called, but Nora kept working. One more spike, one more section completed. The sledgehammer felt impossibly heavy as she raised it again. As it came down, her grip slipped slightly, causing the hammer to land off-center. The spike twisted sideways, the force sending a jolt through her arms as the hammer glanced off. Pain shot through her hand as one of her gloved fingers tore completely away. Blood bloomed instantly, bright red against the pale skin of her knuckles. Still, she reached for another spike, ignoring the stinging. There was work to be done by sunset. Nora's hands were a mess of torn skin and dried blood. Her right index finger had a deep gash that refused to stop bleeding, and her palms were covered in blisters, some broken and weeping. She had worked until her fingers bled, and still she wasn't sure it would be enough to pay this month's board. The crew began packing up tools as the foreman made his final rounds. Nora stood awkwardly, trying to hide her hands, knowing that if Hollister saw how badly injured she was, he might decide she wasn't fit for tomorrow's work. "Miss Thompson," Hollister called, approaching with his clipboard. "Your due payment. Sign here." She took the pencil he offered, wincing as her fingers curled around it. The simple act of marking an X sent fresh pain shooting up her arm. Hollister frowned at her hand. "You need to see Doc Wilkins about those." "I'll be fine, sir," Nora said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Just need to wash up, suit yourself." He handed her a small envelope. "But if you can't work tomorrow, I'll have to find someone else." The threat was clear. Nora tucked the money away carefully and began the long walk back to town, each step sending jolts of pain through her abused hands. The streets of Sweetwater were alive with the usual evening activities, saloon doors swinging, cowboys fresh off the trail looking for entertainment, and shopkeepers closing for the day. Nora kept her head down, trying to avoid attention. A woman alone after dark invited trouble, especially one as obviously out of place as she was. As she passed the general store, the door swung open suddenly, nearly hitting her. A tall man in a dusty hat stepped out, arms laden with supplies. "Pardon me, madam," he said, quickly steadying himself. "Didn't see you there." Nora instinctively reached out to help prevent a sack of flour from tumbling to the ground. The moment her raw fingers touched the rough burlap, she gasped in pain, unable to maintain her grip. The flour hit the boardwalk with a dull thud. "I'm sorry," she said, mortified. "I didn't mean to." Her words died as the stranger looked down at her hands, now visibly bloody in the glow of the store's lantern. His expression changed from casual politeness to concern in an instant. "What happened to your hands?" he asked, setting his remaining packages down carefully. "It's nothing," Nora replied, drawing back. "Just from work. The railroad, that's not nothing," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Those need tending." Before she could protest further, he had removed his bandana and was reaching for her right hand. Nora hesitated, then reluctantly allowed him to examine her injuries. "Name's Dawson Layton," he said as he carefully turned her palm upward. "I've got some supplies that will help with this. My camp's just outside town." Nora stiffened. "I don't go to strangers' camps, Mr. Layton." A slight smile touched his lips beneath a neatly trimmed mustache. "Wise policy. How about the boarding house porch then? I assume that's where you're headed. She studied him more carefully. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his manner direct but respectful. Unlike many men she'd encountered in Sweetwater, his eyes didn't wander inappropriately and there was genuine concern in his expression. Very well, she agreed cautiously. I'm staying at Mrs. Abernathy's. I know the place. He collected his packages, leaving the flour for last. Can you manage a short walk, or should I find a wagon? I've walked all the way from the rail line, Nora said with a touch of pride. I can manage 3 more blocks. They walked in silence, Nora acutely aware of his presence beside her. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the saddle, but there was something else about him, a watchfulness, an alertness to their surroundings that spoke of more than casual caution. When they reached Mrs. Abernathy's, the elderly landlady was sweeping the porch. She raised her eyebrows at the sight of Nora with a strange man. Evening, Mrs. Abernathy, Dawson said respectfully. Miss Thompson, Nora supplied. Nora Thompson. Miss Thompson has injured her hands working the railroad. I've offered to help with some bandages and salve, if that's acceptable on your porch here. Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened as she noticed Nora's hands. Of course, I'll fetch some clean water. She disappeared inside. Sit, Dawson instructed, indicating the porch swing. He set his packages down and opened his saddlebag, withdrawing a small tin and a roll of clean cloth. Are you a doctor, Mr. Layton? Nora asked as she settled onto the swing. No, madam, he replied. Just spent enough time on the trail to know how to patch up injuries. 4 years with the Texas Rangers taught me that much. Mrs. Abernathy returned with a basin of water and a clean towel. Poor girl, she clucked. I told you that railroad work was too harsh. It pays, Nora said simply. Dawson knelt before her and gently took her right hand. With careful motions, he cleaned away the dried blood and dirt, his touch so light that Nora barely felt the pain she'd expected. The water in the basin turned pink, then red as he worked. What brings you to Sweetwater, Miss Thompson? He asked, his focus on her wounds. My father, she replied, then corrected herself. That is, we came together, but he passed shortly after we arrived. Dawson looked up, meeting her eyes with genuine sympathy. I'm sorry to hear that. Thank you, she watched as he applied a greenish salve to her cleaned wounds. And you? What brings a Texas Ranger to Wyoming? Former Ranger, he corrected. I'm working as a stock detective now. Cattle rustlings become a problem for the big outfits. Mrs. Abernathy huffed. Those big outfits are the problem, if you ask me. Squeezing out honest homesteaders with their barbed wire and hired guns. Dawson didn't argue, merely continued his methodical treatment of Nora's hands. You're right that some of the cattle barons overreach, he said diplomatically, but stealing's still stealing. The salve had a pleasant, herbal scent and seemed to cool the burning in Nora's raw skin immediately. She watched in fascination as Dawson began carefully wrapping each finger individually, starting with the worst, her bleeding index finger. This one's deep, he commented. Might leave a small scar. One more won't matter, Nora replied without thinking. Dawson paused, looking up at her with a question in his eyes, but didn't press. He finished wrapping her right hand, then moved to her left, which wasn't quite as badly damaged. You shouldn't be swinging hammers tomorrow, he said as he worked. These need time to heal. I don't have time, Nora said plainly. No work means no pay, Dawson frowned. There must be other work in town that wouldn't tear your hands apart. For a woman alone. Without references or connections, the railroad was the only place that would hire me, she shook her head. I'll manage. He finished bandaging her left hand, but instead of releasing it, he surprised her by lifting it gently to his lips. With infinite tenderness, he placed a soft kiss on her bandaged index finger. For healing, he said softly, then moved to the next finger, repeating the gesture. My grandmother always said a kiss could speed recovery. Nora sat frozen, breath caught in her throat as he continued, kissing each wrapped finger with gentle reverence. No man had ever shown her such tender care, certainly not in Philadelphia's proper society circles, and definitely not in the rough frontier town she now called home. When he finished with her left hand, he took her right, repeating the process with the same gentle care. The last finger, her most injured one, received the longest, softest kiss. There, he said, his voice slightly husky, grandmother's remedy applied. Nora found herself unable to look away from his eyes, warm brown with flecks of gold caught in the fading sunlight. Something passed between them, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Mrs. Abernathy cleared her throat pointedly. "It's getting dark, Miss Thompson. You should come in for supper." The moment broken, Nora nodded and carefully stood. "Thank you, Mr. Layton. I don't know how to repay your kindness. No payment needed." He gathered his supplies and rose to his feet. "But I would appreciate knowing how those hands are doing in a day or two." "I'll be at the rail yard," she said. Dawson frowned again. "At least ask for lighter duties, please." Something in his earnest concern made Nora nod. "I'll try. Good night then, Miss Thompson." He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Abernathy." As he walked away, leading his horse that had been hitched nearby, Nora watched until he disappeared into the gathering dusk. Her hands throbbed less than before, wrapped in clean bandages and somehow, in the lingering warmth of his gentle kisses. "Well, Mrs. Abernathy said, picking up her broom again. "That's the first time I've seen Dawson Layton pay such attention to anyone in this town." "You know him?" Nora asked. "Been staying at the hotel for about a month, keeps to himself mostly." "They say he's good at his job, found rustled cattle that nobody else could track." She gave Nora a meaningful look. "And he's unmarried." "Mrs. Abernathy," Nora protested, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "He was simply being kind." "Hum," the older woman replied skeptically. "Come inside before your supper gets cold." Next morning, Nora awoke to find her hands stiff and painful despite the treatment. She carefully rewrapped them with the extra bandages Dawson had left, wincing as she pulled on her work clothes. The thought of gripping a hammer made her stomach clench, but she had no choice. When she arrived at the rail yard, Hollister took one look at her bandaged hands and shook his head. "Can't use you like that, Thompson." "Please, Mr. Hollister," she began, panic rising. "I need the work." "Didn't say I was firing you," he clarified, "but you'll be of no use on the spike line. Report to the supply wagon. Reynolds needs someone who can count and write." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you, sir." The supply work was significantly easier on her hands, though still demanding in its own way. Reynolds, the quartermaster, was a gruff but fair man who seemed impressed by her careful record-keeping and quick arithmetic. "You've got schooling," he observed during the midday break. "I was a teacher," Nora admitted. "Back east." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "Might be more call for that skill once the town grows. Railroads bringing in families now, not just drifters and fortune seekers." The thought planted a seed of hope that Nora hadn't allowed herself to nurture before. Perhaps there was a future for her here beyond day-to-day survival. As the sun began to set, she was organizing the tool inventory when a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the camp. Dawson Layton sat atop a chestnut gelding, scanning the workers until his gaze found her. He dismounted and approached, nodding politely to the men who glanced his way. "Miss Thompson," he greeted her, "I was passing by and thought I'd check on your hands." Nora felt several curious stares from her coworkers. "They're better, thank you," she said, holding them up to display the bandages, still mostly clean thanks to her lighter duties. "Glad to hear it." He seemed genuinely relieved. "I brought some fresh bandages and more salve, thought you might need them." She accepted the small package he offered. "That's very thoughtful." Reynolds approached, eyeing Dawson with undisguised curiosity. "You're that stock detective, aren't you, Layton?" "Yes, sir." Dawson extended his hand. "Dawson Layton. Any particular reason you're interested in my inventory clerk?" Reynolds asked bluntly. "Just being neighborly," Dawson replied easily. "Miss Thompson had an injury I helped with yesterday." Reynolds looked between them, then shrugged. "Well, we're about done for the day. She's free to go once the tools are counted." "I can wait," Dawson offered, looking to Nora. "Escort you back to town if you'd like." The propriety she'd been raised with warred with the practical realities of frontier life. A proper lady wouldn't accept, but a sensible woman alone in the West wouldn't refuse safe passage. "Thank you," she said finally. "I'll only be a few minutes." True to her word, Nora completed her inventory quickly. When she approached Dawson, he offered her a hand up onto his horse. "I can walk," she protested. 10 miles with injured hands, I think not." His tone brooked no argument. "Cheyenne here is gentle as a lamb, and it'll give your hands more time to rest." Reluctantly, she allowed him to help her into the saddle, then watched as he took the reins and began leading the horse on foot. "You don't need to walk," she said, embarrassed. I'm not so delicate that I can't share a saddle. Dawson glanced up at her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It wouldn't be proper, Miss Thompson. Proper? She couldn't help the short laugh that escaped her. I'm working a railroad line in trousers. I think we're well beyond proper. After a moment's consideration, he swung up behind her with practiced ease. Nora suddenly became acutely aware of his proximity, the solid warmth of his chest barely an inch from her back. Better? He asked, reaching around her to take the reins. Yes, she managed, though her heart had inexplicably begun to race. Thank you. They rode in silence for a while, the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves the only sound. Finally, Dawson spoke. I've been thinking about your situation, he said. The railroad work. Oh. Nora tried to keep her tone neutral. Reynolds mentioned you were a teacher. The town council's been discussing opening a proper school now that there are nearly 30 children in Sweetwater. Hope surged in Nora's chest. A school here, it's still in the planning stages, he cautioned. But I took the liberty of mentioning your qualifications to Mayor Harding this morning. She twisted in the saddle to look at him, wincing as the movement jarred her hands. You did that for me? Why? Their faces were unexpectedly close, his eyes searching hers in the fading light. Because no one should work until they bleed if they have other skills to offer, he said simply. And because I'd like to see you stay in Sweetwater. The admission hung between them, honest and unadorned. Nora felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the sunset or the close quarters of the saddle. I'd like that too, she admitted softly, then faced forward again, afraid her expression might reveal too much. As they approached town, Dawson spoke again. Would you do me the honor of having dinner with me tomorrow evening? The hotel serves a decent meal. The invitation was proper enough, yet Nora hesitated. People will talk. People always talk, he replied, especially in small towns, but there's nothing improper about dinner. No, she agreed, there isn't. They reached Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house just as the lamps were being lit inside. Dawson dismounted first, then offered his hands to help Nora down. Even through her bandages, she could feel the strength in his careful grip as he lifted her down. Until tomorrow, then, he asked, still holding her waist even after her feet touched the ground. Yes, she said. Tomorrow, he smiled then, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made Nora's breath catch. I'll call for you at 6. That night, as she carefully cleaned and rebandaged her hands with Dawson's supplies, Nora found herself smiling. For the first time since her father's death, she felt something like hope taking root. The next evening, dressed in her one good dress navy blue with modest lace at the collar, Nora waited nervously in the boarding house parlor. Mrs. Abernathy had helped her arrange her hair, commenting several times on the fine figure of a man who was calling on her. It's only dinner, Nora insisted, though her racing pulse suggested otherwise. Precisely at 6, Dawson arrived, looking quite different from the trail-worn man she'd first met. His dark hair was neatly combed, his mustache trimmed, and he wore a clean white shirt under a well-cut jacket. He carried a small nosegay of wildflowers. Miss Thompson, he greeted her, his eyes appreciative but respectful. You look lovely. Thank you, Mr. Layton. She accepted the flowers with a smile. These are beautiful. Mrs. Abernathy bustled in with a small vase. I'll put these in water for you, dear. You two enjoy your evening. The hotel dining room was the finest establishment in Sweetwater, which wasn't saying much by Eastern standards, but the tablecloths were clean and the food was well prepared. As they ate, Nora found herself relaxing in Dawson's company. He was well-spoken and knowledgeable about a wide range of topics, from literature to current events. How does a Texas Ranger come to be so well-read? She asked after a particularly insightful comment about Dickens. My mother was determined that her sons would be educated badge or no badge, he replied with a fond smile. She was a schoolteacher before she married my father. Was? Nora asked gently. She passed 3 years ago. Father followed 6 months later. A shadow crossed his face. It's partly why I left the Rangers, wanted to try something new, somewhere different. I understand that feeling, Nora said. After my mother died, Father couldn't bear to stay in our home. He had this idea that the West would offer a fresh start. She looked down at her bandaged hands. I don't think this is what he had in mind for me. Dawson reached across the table, gently taking her right hand in his. I spoke with Mayor Harding again today. The town council is meeting next week to discuss the school proposal formally. He's asked if you would attend to speak about your qualifications. Nora's heart leaped. Truly, truly. His thumb traced light circles on the back of her hand, though I must admit I have selfish reasons for wanting you to stay in Sweetwater. Oh. She managed, though her mouth had suddenly gone dry. I find myself thinking about you more than is probably proper, he admitted, his voice low. About your courage, your determination, your smile. Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks. Mr. Layton, Dawson, please, Dawson, she amended. We've known each other 2 days. Some things don't require lengthy acquaintance to recognize, he said simply. I knew the moment I saw you trying to help with my packages, despite your injured hands, that you were someone special. The sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt. Nora found herself speechless, caught in the warm gaze of his eyes across the table. I'm not asking for anything but the chance to know you better, he continued, to see if what I believe is true. And what do you believe? She whispered. That some people are meant to find each other, even across vast distances. That my path was always supposed to lead to Sweetwater at precisely the moment you needed someone to tend your hands. The simple poetry of his words touched something deep inside her. I'd like that chance too, she admitted. His smile was worth any risk her heart might face. In the weeks that followed, Nora's hands healed completely, though the deep cut on her index finger left a small, silvery scar just as Dawson had predicted. She continued working for the railroad, but only in the supply office, where Reynolds came to value her organizational skills and quick mind. The town council approved the school proposal, and Nora was hired as Sweetwater's first official teacher to start once the simple schoolhouse was completed in late summer. In the meantime, she began holding informal classes in the church on Saturdays for children eager to learn. Dawson's work as a stock detective kept him riding the range periodically, tracking rustlers and recovering stolen cattle. But he always returned to Sweetwater to her. Their courtship progressed with proper decorum on the surface, but underneath ran a current of deep connection that neither had experienced before. On a warm June evening, nearly 2 months after they'd met, Dawson took Nora on a picnic to a meadow overlooking the valley where Sweetwater nestled. The wildflowers were in full bloom, painting the landscape with vibrant colors. I've received a wire from the Cattle Association, Dawson said as they finished their meal. They're pleased with my work and want me to take on a more permanent position. Nora's heart sank. Does that mean you'll be leaving? That depends, he said, taking her hand, the one with the small scar on the index finger. On whether I have a reason to stay. Her breath caught as he lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to that scar. The position would be based here, overseeing security for ranches throughout the territory. It would mean a permanent home. His eyes met hers. A home I'd like to share if you're willing. Are you asking what I think you're asking? Nora whispered. In answer, Dawson reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring with a modest diamond. Nora Thompson, I've loved you since I bandaged your hands that first night. I'll love you for all the days I have left. Will you marry me? Tears sprang to Nora's eyes. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms for a kiss that held all the tenderness of those first healing kisses to her injured fingers, but with a depth of passion that spoke of their future together. As summer gave way to autumn, Sweetwater celebrated its first proper wedding in the newly completed church. Nora, radiant in a cream-colored gown that Mrs. Abernathy had helped her make, walked down the aisle to where Dawson waited, his eyes never leaving hers. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promising love and faithfulness through whatever challenges life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Dawson lifted Nora's right hand and, in full view of the entire town, pressed a gentle kiss to the small scar on her index finger before kissing her lips to seal their union. The schoolhouse opened the following week with Mrs. Layton proudly welcoming 24 students to their first day of formal education in Sweetwater. By Christmas, the town had grown enough to justify expanding the school, and Nora found herself busier than ever, but happily so. Dawson's work continued to take him away periodically, but never for long. Each homecoming was a celebration, each parting softened by the certainty of return. Their small house on the edge of town became known for its welcoming light and the sound of laughter that often spilled from its windows. In the spring of 1880, Nora placed Dawson's hand on her growing belly, watching his face transform with wonder as he felt their child move for the first time. "A teacher or a ranger, do you think?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Perhaps both," Nora replied, covering his hand with hers, the same hands that had once bled from hard labor, now strong and capable in a different way. "Our child will have all the choices I never thought I would." Dawson gathered her close. "When I found you that night with your bleeding hands, I never imagined how completely you would change my life." "You changed mine first," she reminded him. "You saw value in me when all I could see was survival." "I saw you," he said simply, "just as you saw me." As they stood together in the golden light of sunset, Nora reflected on the strange path that had led her to this place, the grief that had brought her west, the desperate work that had wounded her, and the gentle cowboy who had bandaged her fingers and kissed each one tenderly, setting her heart on a course she never could have imagined. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest love stories begin with bleeding hands and tender care. And sometimes, the hardest journeys lead exactly where we're meant to be.